For the past several weeks, reports have been swirling that Trump believed he had Russia on board for a Ukraine ceasefire, a high-stakes gamble that could have dramatically changed the course of the war in Ukraine. But then, in a sudden and humiliating reversal, Putin flat-out rejected Trump's plan and effectively slammed the door on peace talks. Why would Putin do this? Why reject negotiations that might have diffused tensions, even partly? And what does that mean for Trump, who for a long time seemed to think he and Putin shared a special understanding? Today we're going to dive deep into these questions and unravel the motivations, ramifications, and next steps in this incredibly complex story. We'll also explore what this might mean for the war in Ukraine, U.S. foreign policy, and the broader balance of power worldwide. But before we get into all that, I want to thank you all for tuning in. If you enjoy in-depth analysis of political events, major power plays, and the hidden stories shaping our world, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. It only takes a second to click that subscribe button. And while you're at it, leave a like on this video if you find value in this type of content. And let me know in the comments what you think about this dramatic turn of events. Your feedback matters immensely, and it helps this channel continue to grow. Now let's jump into the story. To fully understand the magnitude of Putin's apparent betrayal, we have to revisit the peculiar relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. For years, Trump and Putin have had a highly scrutinized dynamic, with media outlets, politicians, and observers around the globe parsing every handshake, every seemingly friendly statement, every subtle signal between the two leaders. During Trump's presidency, there was widespread speculation about how close or how distant these two men really were. Some claim that Trump viewed Putin as a sort of role model for strong governance, pointing out how Trump often spoke with a certain respect for Putin's assertive style. Others argued that their relationship was overstated, that yes, they might have publicly acknowledged each other's positions and exchanged kind words, but behind closed doors, the geopolitical interests of the United States and Russia often clashed. When Trump left office, the wariness of his critics remained. Many wondered, would Trump continue to nurture this relationship even as he was out of the Oval Office? Where did their loyalties really lie? Especially with tensions between Russia and Ukraine taking center stage in global discourse. Then, as the war in Ukraine intensified, we witnessed a series of statements from Trump that seemed to suggest he had a plan, if not to end the war outright, at least to broker something resembling a truce or ceasefire. Rumors started circulating that Trump was in direct contact with influential figures in Moscow, and he apparently came away from these talks believing that Putin was open to a pause in hostilities, some form of negotiation, or at least a slower escalation. Yet in international relations, a single misunderstanding can completely upend the narrative. Sometimes political leaders overestimate their sway or misread signals. In Trump's case, the growing consensus is that he believed, perhaps mistakenly, that Putin was truly ready to wind down the war. In reality, Russia may have been pursuing other goals entirely. When the official rejection of negotiations emerged, this dynamic changed virtually overnight. At first glance, one might think, why is it such a big deal if Putin decided not to accept Trump's peace overtures? Isn't that just standard politics, considering that many leaders try to negotiate peace deals and fail? The difference here lies in the scope of the war in Ukraine and the complexities of U.S.-Russia relations. A ceasefire, even a temporary one, would have enormous implications on the ground. It might relieve pressure on certain Ukrainian regions under siege. It might buy time for humanitarian assistance to reach those in need. And from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy, it could potentially serve as a stepping stone to a broader peace process, though, in fairness, that might be an idealistic perspective. But for Trump personally, this was also a big test of his so-called deal-making prowess, the same attribute he boasted about throughout his political career. For someone who prides himself on being able to negotiate better deals than any other leader, failing so visibly in a high-profile gambit is both personally embarrassing and politically damaging. It suggests that perhaps this skill has limitations, particularly in the realm of geopolitics where countless factors intersect, from territorial ambitions to global alliances. Putin's dismissal of Trump's ceasefire idea doesn't just tarnish Trump's image. It also raises the prospect that the conflict in Ukraine might escalate further. If there was even a small opening for diplomacy, that window might now be closing rapidly. Moreover, it underscores a critical reality. Even if Trump thought he had a special line of communication to the Kremlin, it doesn't mean that line was actually as influential as he believed. If Russia prefers to continue pursuing its objectives in Ukraine through military means, any external negotiation attempts could be sidelined or outright ridiculed. One question that keeps coming up is, why would Putin seemingly turn on Trump so dramatically and so publicly? After all, when you think about the possibility of a ceasefire, you'd imagine that even if Putin wasn't fully on board, he might keep the door open for strategic reasons. But the total rejection and the humiliation that accompanied it suggests that Putin wanted to make a statement, both to Trump and the wider world. One factor could be that Putin wants to maintain full strategic flexibility in Ukraine. Accepting any form of ceasefire or negotiation might be seen as a sign of weakness. Despite significant challenges Russia has faced in the war, Putin may still believe that a more forceful approach can achieve his goals. If he momentarily paused or scaled back operations to negotiate, that could give Ukraine time to reorganize, to receive more Western military support, or to bolster its defenses. Another factor might be Putin's view of Trump as a diminished figure. When Trump was president of the United States, the stakes of humiliating him were much higher because it could have massive geopolitical blowback. But as a former president, especially one who has faced legal challenges and remains a polarizing figure in U.S. politics, perhaps Putin feels that outright rejection won't cause the same repercussions. It could be Putin's way of signaling that Russia deals with current American leadership on official matters, and that it won't consider side deals or negotiations from private individuals, no matter how influential they believe themselves to be. There's also the question of Russia's relationship with other global powers, including China. Putin may have determined that aligning more closely with Beijing or maintaining a stance of defiance against Western interests is more beneficial than entertaining any proposals Trump might put forward. From Putin's perspective, keeping the war simmering might continue to weaken NATO unity or test Western resolve. If Russia suspects that extended conflict will exhaust Western governments and cause internal divisions, they might be banking on that scenario rather than opting for a ceasefire now. Let's delve a bit deeper into what Trump may have been thinking going into these attempted negotiations. Although Trump is known for his unpredictable nature and a preference for bold claims, he often sells himself as the consummate dealmaker. It's not out of the realm of possibility that he truly believed he had a unique angle to sway Putin. Perhaps Trump thought that their historically cordial public statements indicated a deeper bond or mutual respect. Maybe he believed that a partial settlement would validate his claims that he could end the Ukraine conflict quickly if given the chance. Yet this entire move might have been based on outdated assumptions or a misunderstanding of Russia's priorities. One could argue that Trump overestimates the power of personal rapport in geopolitics, assuming that if two leaders have had some amicable exchanges, that can override complex strategic considerations. If Putin indeed never intended to scale back in Ukraine, then Trump's discussions were doomed from the start. Alternatively, if there was some initial interest from the Russian side, other global developments may have changed the calculus, leaving Trump on the receiving end of a harsh rejection. It's also possible that Trump underestimated how public and direct Putin's rejection would be. Even if negotiations collapsed, Trump might have expected Putin to couch his refusal in more diplomatic language or keep the channels of communication open, out of deference to their past relationship. But in geopolitics, there is sometimes an advantage in demonstrating that you can and will dismiss someone's overtures unequivocally, especially if it sends a message to other players, from European capitals to Beijing, that Russia is not desperate or dependent on external forces to achieve its aims. For Ukraine, this turn of events might actually be bittersweet news. On one hand, the total rejection of a ceasefire might mean more intense fighting on the ground, with devastating humanitarian consequences. Every day that the conflict continues is another day of shelling, displacement, and tremendous risk to human life. On the other hand, if Ukraine's leadership was skeptical of any deal brokered by Trump, they might find some relief in knowing that the conflict's resolution still depends on official negotiations with recognized global powers and alliances, rather than private individuals. Additionally, a clearer understanding that Putin is not willing to negotiate on certain terms might strengthen Ukrainian resolve and unity with its Western allies. If there was ever a veneer of possible compromise, that may have been shattered, galvanizing further support from NATO countries and other international backers who see Russia's intransigence as a sign that more robust defense of Ukraine is necessary. Moving forward, Ukraine will likely continue to lobby for international support, pointing to episodes like this to highlight the futility of trusting Russian intentions at face value. In doing so, Ukrainian officials may accelerate demands for more advanced weaponry, additional financial support, and broader diplomatic backing. The rejection, in other words, might help unify pro-Ukraine coalitions internationally, reinforcing the narrative that Russia's leadership cannot be reasoned with at present, thereby increasing pressure and possibly even leading to more sanctions against Russia. Beyond just Trump, Putin, and Ukraine, there are broader international consequences to this fallout. For starters, other governments might reevaluate their own relations with Russia, seeing this episode as evidence that Moscow is willing to risk significant diplomatic bridges in pursuit of its strategic objectives. Countries that had been on the fence might now more definitively pick a side, given the unpredictability and harshness of Russia's move. In the United States, the embarrassment for Trump could also have a ripple effect on domestic politics. For Trump's supporters, they might try to downplay or reinterpret the situation, perhaps insisting that Trump was misled or that the media has distorted the facts. For Trump's opponents, this becomes more ammunition to claim that Trump has consistently misread Putin and mismanaged foreign policy issues. Meanwhile, for President Biden or any current U.S. administration figures, the event can be leveraged as a cautionary tale, exemplifying that private overtures to Russia can result in very public smackdowns. This may reinforce the argument that a united front with Western allies is the only path that has any chance of success in influencing Russian behavior. Outside the U.S., NATO leaders and European Union officials might see this as validation of their more unified stance. If Putin spurned Trump's proposals so openly, it indicates that only a collective approach can yield results, and even then, the obstacles remain huge. Even nations that have historically tried to mediate between Russia and the West might realize that any attempt to broker a quick solution could fail just as spectacularly if Russia isn't genuinely interested in negotiation. Throughout history, there have been many instances when leaders from different countries seem to have unusual alliances or cordial relationships, only for those to implode under geopolitical pressures. The narrative of friendship between the leaders of powerful nations can crumble in an instant when core strategic interests are threatened. For instance, during World War II, alliances shifted rapidly, as soon as certain nations perceived that it was more beneficial to collaborate with a former rival than to remain consistent with their earlier relationships. In a more modern sense, we've seen how leaders who've publicly praised each other can quickly fall out if domestic or international pressures leave them little choice. With Putin and Trump, it's entirely possible that we are witnessing a classic example of such a pivot. Putin might have once found it advantageous to maintain a semblance of goodwill or open communication with Trump, but as the war in Ukraine intensifies and global stakes rise, that advantage might have evaporated. Moreover, a leader like Putin will likely always prioritize a path that strengthens Russia's position, even if it means casting aside any personal or political ties with foreign figures who are no longer deemed useful. If Russia sees the potential for territorial gains or a strategic advantage in sustaining the conflict, then backing off would be seen as a net loss. Now let's speculate on what Trump might do in response. One possibility is that he'll double down, insisting that there was some kind of misunderstanding or misrepresentation of Putin's stance. Trump is well known for reframing situations to maintain an image of being in control. He might claim that the media twisted Putin's words, or that certain deep state actors sabotaged the negotiations. Alternatively, He might pivot the blame entirely onto Putin, labeling him as unpredictable or untrustworthy, trying to salvage his own reputation as a deal-maker who was betrayed by a bad-faith actor. Another angle is that Trump could attempt to leverage his political connections within the U.S. or with other countries to pressure Russia indirectly. Though he lacks the formal powers of the presidency, he still has influential allies and a significant public platform. Whether or not that pressure would be effective is debatable, but one can imagine Trump rallying his base around a narrative that says, "I tried to bring peace, Putin said no, and now we need to confront him more aggressively." There's also the possibility that Trump might step back from foreign policy commentary altogether for a while, particularly if polls or public sentiment indicate that this move hurt his standing. As someone who's very responsive to his audience, he may decide that continuing to push for a Russia deal is no longer politically beneficial. If he's eyeing a future run for office or trying to maintain influence within the Republican Party, he might shift focus to domestic issues where he can more easily rally supporters without risking another high-profile foreign policy fiasco. Looking at U.S.-Russia relations more broadly, this event will likely reinforce the current trajectory, a high level of mistrust, tense diplomatic relations, and the possibility of further escalation. With the war in Ukraine at the forefront, any illusions that behind-the-scenes negotiations could ease tensions seem to have been shattered. Official U.S. policy, as shaped by President Biden and the broader political apparatus, has firmly sided with Ukraine. Additional sanctions on Russian individuals and entities remain on the table. Military support to Ukraine continues to flow from the United States, NATO, and other allied nations. In such an environment, the chance of a spontaneous or informal peace initiative delivering meaningful results is minimal. Traditionally, ceasefires or peace treaties are orchestrated by recognized diplomatic channels under significant international oversight. The notion that a private individual could unilaterally broker an agreement was always something of a long shot. Going forward, we might see Russia becoming more emboldened if it perceives that key Western countries are unable to unify behind a stronger stance. Conversely, if this humiliation of Trump is read as a clear sign that Russia is disinterested in negotiations, it might galvanize Western powers to up the ante in support of Ukraine, providing more sophisticated weapon systems or greater financial packages. It's a delicate balance, and each side is constantly assessing the shifting global dynamics. The media landscape has been ablaze with theories, criticisms, and sensational headlines about this turn of events. On certain networks that are generally supportive of Trump, you might see efforts to minimize the impact of Putin's rejection, framing it as a minor setback or the product of misinformation. On other networks that are more critical of Trump, the narrative focuses on how this was inevitable, suggesting that Trump's entire posture toward Putin was misguided from the start. For the public at large, this betrayal might be seen as both surprising and yet oddly predictable. Surprising because Trump and Putin's relationship was so frequently portrayed as unusually friendly or at least less confrontational compared to other U.S. and Russian leaders historically. Predictable because, at the end of the day, major powers act in their own best interest, and personal relationships can only go so far when core strategic objectives clash. International media, particularly in Europe, has been quick to highlight that this turn of events reaffirms the necessity of a strong and unified stance against Russian aggression. Publications in nations that border Russia are likely to highlight the folly of any unilateral approach. Meanwhile, media in places like China might observe the situation from a distance, analyzing how it affects the power balance and possibly gleaning lessons for their own diplomatic strategies. One of the most pressing concerns following this public rejection is whether the war will escalate to an even more dangerous level. If Putin is outright dismissive of negotiations, it signals a willingness to continue or even intensify military operations. Some analysts fear that Russia might embark on new offensives, targeting additional Ukrainian cities or infrastructure. Others speculate that Russia's strategy might involve freezing the conflict through the winter to create new leverage in energy markets, putting pressure on Europe. In either case, a ceasefire seems increasingly unlikely in the short term. Ukraine, meanwhile, could interpret Putin's rejection as a green light to press on with counteroffensives. If there's no near-term hope for negotiation, Ukrainian forces might focus on retaking strategic territories, pushing harder if they can secure more weapons and logistical support from NATO. This could lead to a bloody bloody stalemate, where both sides believe they have some advantage to gain by continuing to fight. For countries that have been hesitant to send more arms to Ukraine for fear of provoking Russia, this development might change their calculations. If Russia itself is making it clear that no diplomatic breakthrough is acceptable, then holding back on aid might seem pointless. Consequently, the war could escalate not only in terms of local ground battles, but also in the broader scope of international involvement, with more advanced weaponry entering the fray. We cannot ignore the humanitarian dimension. Every day the war continues, civilian casualties mount, and infrastructure deteriorates. From hospitals to schools to vital supply chains, Ukraine's social fabric is under immense strain. While any short-lived or partial ceasefire can alleviate some of this suffering, the total shutdown of negotiation possibilities condemns civilians to more hardship. This crisis extends beyond Ukraine's borders, too. Neighboring countries face the challenges of hosting large numbers of refugees, adjusting economic policies, and worrying about the conflict spilling over. Russia's economy is also feeling the impact of extended warfare and global sanctions, which affects ordinary Russian citizens even if they have little say in their government's decisions. When a high-profile figure like Trump claims to have a solution and then fails, it raises and then dashes hopes. Humanitarian organizations might have briefly considered the window of opportunity that a ceasefire could bring, time to deliver aid or evacuate vulnerable populations. Now they face the sobering reality that any such respite is not coming, at least not from this angle. If Trump's gambit has truly failed, does that leave any other potential mediators who might step forward? There has been occasional mention of Turkey, which played a role in facilitating certain grain export agreements. Nations like Israel or India have also been floated as potential neutral brokers. However, none of these efforts have so far led to a broad ceasefire or peace agreement. The entire scenario underscores the difficulty of mediating in a conflict where one party, Russia, appears determined to achieve specific territorial or political goals through military means. Neutral intermediaries can propose frameworks, host delegations, or act as go-betweens, but if the warring parties are not motivated to compromise, these initiatives often stall. Multilateral forums like the United Nations could also theoretically offer a venue for peace talks, but the Security Council structure complicates any meaningful resolution. Moreover, any potential UN action can be blocked by Russia's veto. Thus, for the time being, it doesn't appear that a new mediator is ready to fill the vacuum left by Trump's failure. We should also note that the Kremlin's messaging around this incident is very deliberate. By openly and harshly rejecting Trump's proposal, Russia positions itself as not dependent on outside figures. It also sends a message internally to Russian citizens that no external influencer can dictate Russian actions in Ukraine. This kind of stance can bolster Putin's image domestically as a strong leader who won't bow to Western pressures, even if those pressures come from individuals who were once considered to have friendly ties to Moscow. From a propaganda standpoint, the Kremlin might spin this as an example of Russia's autonomy and resistance. State-controlled media could emphasize that Trump's attempt was naive or that it was some form of Western trick to undermine Russia's sovereign interests. This narrative can rally Russian nationalists who view any negotiation at this point as a betrayal of the war effort. In the months ahead, we'll see how Trump's unsuccessful attempt impacts his standing in U.S. politics. Will it become a talking point in debates or potential campaign speeches? Will it cause rifts within the Republican Party, with some elements questioning the wisdom of courting Putin's favor? We don't yet know, but it's likely that Trump will address this publicly and try to reshape the narrative to his advantage. For Ukraine and its allies, the message seems clear. Russia is not in a mood to compromise. If anything, the war could escalate further, intensifying calls for more international support. If Russia continues to push militarily, we may see an extended conflict with dire humanitarian costs, or we might see breakthroughs on the battlefield that force Russia back to the negotiating table, but not, apparently, at Trump's behest. This betrayal also sets a precedent for the limits of personal diplomacy. The idea that a single individual, even a former president with some history of friendly overtures, could unravel such a complex war may have always been unrealistic. Indeed, the entire fiasco underscores that lasting peace requires deeper engagement from a broad coalition of stakeholders, robust diplomatic channels, and a willingness willingness from all parties to come to the table with genuine concessions in mind. What happens next is anyone's guess. Will Putin's rejection be followed by more aggressive moves on the ground? Will Trump try again, perhaps with a different approach? Or will the entire affair simply fade into the background as the war grinds on, overshadowed by new headlines and new crises? Time will tell, but for now, the outlook is sobering. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. If you made it to this point, I deeply appreciate your time and your commitment to staying informed about the complexities of world events. If you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to this channel for regular updates and analyses on unfolding global stories. Don't forget to like the video and drop a comment below, sharing your perspective on Putin's rejection of Trump's ceasefire proposal. Do you think there was ever a real chance for peace, or was this a doomed effort from the start?